So, hi, as Sean mentioned, my name is Todd, and I'm here to talk to you about the wonders of beer. So, just a quick survey. How many people here drink beer less than 2 or 3 times a week? Not drinking beer at all counts as less than 2 or 3 times a week. Oh, shut up, Ian.
No, I drink whiskey.
Oh, you graduated.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, how about between 3 and 7 times a week? Okay, and how many of you are college students? So greater than 7 times a week. Got it. So this is going to be a basic talk about entry levels, what you need to know about beer, what goes into it, what different styles are, so you can try and enjoy different things if you go out for more beer. Make sense? And as always, feel free to stop me if you have any questions, you don't understand a term I used, anything like that, as this is aimed for middle of the road, and some of you don't know what's going on, or I might have something wrong, so if I miss something, butt in and tell me. Next slide. So, what qualifies me to actually stand up here and tell you about beer? I have actually been drinking and partaking in the delightful nectar for, let's see, I turned 21, a year now, 1.5 years. Yep. And actually, in that time, this is a little inaccurate. This is since the beginning of last summer. I have had 250 unique beers, all of which I can roughly tell you how good they were, if you ask me. And to be perfectly honest, I love this stuff, as you can tell by the I Love Beer sign and the shirt. So, we're going to start with a very simple question. What is beer? Now, beer is very rigidly defined by the RandTalk, which is the German beer purity law, which was originated in the city of Ingolstadt in the Duchy of Bavaria, the 23rd of April in 1516. Now, according to this, hello, here for the beer talk?
Not really.
You're going to pretend you're here for the beer talk and pay attention?
I'm going to pretend to be here while I run to the post office.
Fantastic. So, according to this law, there are 4 ingredients of beer. Now, the first main ingredient is water. Beer is actually mostly 80% water. Biggest problem. Now, you might think water is water is water is water, but that's actually not true. All over the world, different waters have different mineral contents, which will lend them to different styles of beer. For instance, you know how Guinness always tastes better in Ireland? That's because the water in Dublin actually has mineral contents that make it better for stouts, such as Guinness. Don't worry if you don't know what a stout is, we'll get to that later. The next ingredient in beer, and the first one I have for you guys to sample, is something called malted barley. Now, barley is a cereal grain, and it is the key source of starch and sugar. Here, smell some. And I'll be passing around samples for you guys to smell. And they're not sunflower seeds, but they're really close. There you go. Smell those, pass them around. This is actually going to be... Sorry, I had to wait. Here, have some barley.
Todd, I take it I'm not allowed to snort this?
Go ahead, I got plenty. So, for beer usage, we take the barley grain and we malt it. Now, malting is a process by which you wet the seed so it starts to grow, and then you dry it using hot air to stunt that growth. So the barleys you have are both malted, and there is a lighter roasted one and a darker roasted one. I think you can probably tell which one is which, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Racist.
What?
I'm not racist.
I know. But you're not blind either. So, when I'm going to talk, later I'll be talking about different styles of beer, and if I say it has a dark malty backbone, or dark malty characteristics, that's going to be indicative of the darker cup of barley you just smelled. Whereas a lighter, clearer malty backbone will be indicative of the paler, clearer barley you just smelled. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. The next ingredient in beer is hops. Now, hops are actually my personal favorite ingredient because I frankly like the taste. Now, we have a much smaller sample of hops, so take some, take a whiff. Unlike the barley, you do not want to eat those. They are really concentrated, really bitter, and they're just... But they smell fantastic, so take a good whiff of those. If you ever feel like a beer is really hoppy or has a high hop count, that's what it's going to smell and taste like. Personally, I think that makes it smell and taste fantastic, but I'm a crazy person. Now, a little bit about the hops is it's actually the flower of the Humus lupulus plant, which grows in a similar environment to grapes. So if you understand various places you can grow grapes for winemaking, you can also grow hops for beer making in similar locations. And similar to grapes, you have both Old World and New World hops. The Old World hops are going to be a much more subdued, slightly spicier flavor, whereas the New World hops, like what you guys have there, which is actually a variant called Cascade, are going to be a much bolder, bitter, and even fruitier flavor. So if you can, what?
Looks like gerbil food.
Yeah, those are hop pellets. You can get almost 90% of the hops you're going to see, especially out here, all the beers are going to use hop pellets. You can actually get fresh or wet hops, but that's only in season. They don't transport well, but they do lend a much more intense and bitter flavor. Now, for those of you who have smelt it or are smelling it now, if you can get past the bitter, with those being Cascade hops, you also get very heavy fruity and especially grapefruity notes, and they're what can lend a lot of the fruitiness or grassiness to a beer with high hop content. Make sense? Any questions? Okay, so the fourth and final ingredient that can be in a beer is actually yeast. Now, back when the RandTalk was written, yeast was not included because this was before the advent of germ theory. They didn't actually know yeast existed. So for those of you who don't know what yeast is, it is a small microorganism that converts sugar to alcohol and CO2. So basically, yeast is God because yeast makes booze. And there are actually two major types of yeast, top fermenting and bottom fermenting. We'll get into more of what that means and where those are used later. And a few side types, but we don't really have to worry about that. So, that is according to German beer purity law. If you want something you produce in Germany to be called beer, it can only include those four ingredients: water, barley, hops, and yeast. Now, if you're not German, and most likely American, especially a member of the American craft brewing revolution, you can put whatever the heck you want into beer. You can throw in orange peel, chocolate, oak chips, vanilla. Heck, Stone does one with chipotle peppers and porter. It's ridiculous and actually pretty damn delicious. Cream goes well in porters. Really, anything you want. Cherries. You can just go nuts. And one of the main ways of doing this is you take all of those things, put them in a giant tea bag, and just toss in the beer as it's brewing, which we'll see that where you put it in later. But yeah, those are the four basic ingredients, but you can throw anything on top of that for a stranger beer. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Good. So now that we know what actually goes into beer, we're going to go over how to make it. Now, I will confess, I have never actually homebrewed. I'm not an expert in homebrewing. If you have any serious questions about homebrewing or would like to start it, I can direct you to our good friend Andy Lyon here, because he has actually homebrewed in the past, and I believe he's doing so now or doing so in the future, maybe? Yep. And also, if you can't find him, there's this wonderful place called Rock Brewing. It's actually a very small brewery in downtown Rochester that was started by a couple of RIT grads a few years back. And those two guys love their beer, love making their beer, and more importantly, love talking to people about their beer. So if you are over 21, you can pop over there and talk to them about their beer, what they put into it, how they brew it, and they can actually show you some of the stuff they use. Okay? But your basic premise for making beer. You start by mixing malt and hot water, and this goes into a big old, essentially, vat. And that mixes together and produces something called a wort. And that's actually the stage where you chuck in the big old tea bag, whatever flavors you want. And then you take that wort, you add hops, preferably however many you want or however acidic you want them to be. And you throw them into a big old copper tin to mix up and get more flavor and get some of the bitter acid out of the hops to improve the flavor. Then, occasionally you remove the hops, you don't really have to. After that, you use a heat exchanger to bring that big bubbling mass. Remember, started with hot water, and you're essentially melting grain into water, so it's going to be pretty hot. So for certain types of beer, you need to cool that down to get to the right fermenting temperature. Some you need to heat it back up. But you pass it through a heat exchanger to get it to the right temperature. Then you add it to another giant tank and throw yeast in. And this is where the magic happens. The yeast will eat all the sugar in the barley and convert that into CO2 and alcohol, and also release a lot of flavors and make the beer better. That's how you go from essentially mush to beer. And then after that, you either bottle it or cask it. Any questions? I know that was a very brief overview, but that's pretty much all it is. Yes? No? Okay. Apparently I'm much more informative than I thought. So, now we're going to talk about the actual types of beer you can find. Now that we know the basic things that go into it, how you make it, all the boring technical stuff. there are two major types, lagers and ales, and we'll go over what that means in a second. However, all beers you're going to be able to grade on color, golden, amber, and brown or black. Again, they're very self-explanatory, and you'll see plenty of pictures coming up. But essentially, any beer you can fit into one of these four quadrants. This is like a golden lager, golden ale, maybe a dark brown pale lager, a bitter lager. Really hard to find. Really, really hard to find. That's why it's blank. Okay, so does that make sense to people? Four basic quadrants of beer, the two basic ways of determining it. So categorizing it as a sweet or bitter, and then based on color. Yes? No? Mm-hmm. Okay. So sorry. I keep forgetting that isn't synced up to that. It's okay. So, there are two major types of beer. They use two major types of yeast. On your left, yes, on your left is an ale. On your right is a lager. Now, there are many subtypes and variants of both, but any and all beer can be broken down into an ale, a lager, or the crazy cousin we don't invite to parties, but we'll talk about him later. Make sense? So, a lager. This is where the yeast differential comes in. A lager is going to be fermented at colder temperatures, usually around 10 degrees Celsius, and with bottom fermenting yeast. So if you remember back to the heat exchanger, you're going to pull a lot of heat out of that wort before you add the yeast. And again, the yeast will settle at the bottom, and that usually ferments for a longer period of time at a colder temperature. And that is going to produce a clearer, crisper beer with slightly less color and slightly less complex flavors, but it is slightly more drinkable and slightly more palatable. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, you have ales. Ales are going to be fermented at a much higher temperature because that's the temperature the yeast works best at. So make sense? You have two types of yeast that works best at two different temperatures. Lager yeast is at a lower temperature, ale yeast is a higher temperature. And that ferments on the top, as you can see clearly in this picture, that bubbling brownish gloop, that's the yeast sitting on top of the beer as it ferments. Okay? Mm-hmm. So, two major types of beer. Anybody? What are the two major types of beer? Just say it.
One's right there.
Thank you. So, now we are going to start talking about varying subtypes of those. And the first subtype we're going to deal with are the lagers. And the very first one of those is the American Adjunct Lager, which is by far and away the most popular and best-selling type of beer, along with its light variant, for those people who think that Mona Lisa should have a mustache. To back that statement up, beer is alcoholic bread. Bread and alcohol are both major sources of calories. If you're going to make a light beer, you are removing the whole point of having beer in the first place, so screw light beer. Anyway, back to the more important bit. Now, an American Adjunct Lager is going to be pale, light-bodied. That means it's going to taste more like water on your mouth, whereas a heavier-bodied beer is going to taste more like whole milk. It's going to be a pale, light-bodied, slightly fizzy, and not really big in the whole flavor department. And the reason it's actually called an adjunct lager is because along with the use of barley, they will occasionally throw in things like corn and rice and wheat to bring down the cost of production and allow mass production. That is the main point of an American Adjunct Lager, is to make the same thing a lot and sell it and get it out the door. Now, as I've said, I don't really like this type of beer, but as a beer snob, they're actually very impressive. Because with something that thin, that low in flavor, it's almost impossible to hide defects. And if you'll notice, any Budweiser you get anywhere in the world will taste like any other Budweiser you get anywhere in the world. So it's very, very impressive that they can produce something like that consistently everywhere. It doesn't mean it's good. So, the next variant, which is significantly more simple, is the Pilsner, or you'll occasionally see it called a Czech Pilsner, because it was invented in the Czech town of Pilsen. Yeah, Pilsen. And that was in the 1840s. Again, this is going to be a lager, so you're going to be lighter and paler in color, with actually prevalent hops in a Pilsner, as compared to American Adjunct, which is going to be low in hops, low in everything. And the thing is, the ones you guys smelt are New World hops. In your traditional Czech Pilsner, you use Old World hops, which means you have a lot less bitter, a lot less big floral notes, and it's much more focused on the spiciness and the subtle flavors that they impart. Okay? But again, Pilsners, pretty damn delicious. And almost all of the beers you're seeing pictures of up here, you can get at Beers of the World. And I think most of them you can get at McGregor's as well. So that, the Great Lakes Czech Pils, and that's actually brewed over in Ohio. And it's actually pretty good. I would recommend it if you can find it. Okay? So the next one is the American Double or Imperial Pilsner. Now, this is a very important point of vocabulary. If you say a double or imperial style of beer, that usually just means they take the base style, crank everything up to 11 and leave it there. So an American double imperial pilsner would be similar to a Czech pilsner, but have higher hops, higher flavor, higher alcohol, higher everything. So if you say, I quite fancy a good pilsner, but I think it's a little weak for my taste, try an imperial pilsner, try a double pilsner, something like that. Okay? And this imperial or double thing will actually pop up a lot. It's a good qualification, except for English beers because they're crazy. They like to use the word extra. So the next one is actually interesting. You know how I mentioned we have ales, lagers, and the crazy cousins we don't invite to a party? Mm-hmm. This actually falls into that camp. Because, while it is, I'm mentioning the lagers because it uses lager yeast, it is actually fermented at ale temperatures. Because this was invented in California before the advent of refrigeration. So they couldn't bring the temperature down to where you could actually use a lager. So it is still technically lager yeast, but it's ale temperature, so it's somewhere in the middle. But it's actually going to be light amber, Teutonian in color. So if you say amber beer, it looks, the picture isn't great here, but it's going to be more of a dark reddish hue, almost like amber. And that is also going to be mildly fruity with assertive hop notes. So more hoppier than a Pilsner and slightly fruity, if you like them that way. An interesting note, steam beer is actually copyrighted. The only company that is allowed to call what they make steam beer is Anchor Steam in San Francisco. Everybody else has to call it a California Common, but they're the same thing. Okay? So, our next style is the Bock. This is German beer. This is the heart of German beer. This is, if you ever see a German drinking a beer, 90% of the time, it's Bock. It is beer. That is what they make. This is what beer purity law was designed for. If you are calling something a Bock and it does not have, it has something other than those 4 ingredients, they will hurt you. They're Germans. They're crazy. However, hi, Kat.
Hi.
Didn't mean to insult your people, Kat.
No, you're right.
So anyway, this, actually, interesting story. This was started by monastic monks because they realized during periods of fasting you can't eat anything. But as I said, beer is liquid bread. So during a fast, they would drink water and beer, and that's it. So if you ever really just want to spend a long time getting hammered, become a monk. And we'll talk more about the monks later. But your traditional German Bock is going to be a very strong lager with a robust character and a dark amber or brown color. So it's going to use a lot more of those darker roasted malts that I passed around. Anybody still got those? Yeah, take one of those. That's what they're going to use in a German Bock. And there's also going to be slightly higher in alcohol content and slightly higher in flavor. Not that much in the way of hops, but more a malty beer. Okay? See if I got everything there? Yeah. Basically, along with the German law, if you keep reading through Reinschalt, to make a proper Bock, you are allowed to add enough hops to balance malt flavor, but not to overwhelm it. Yes, I know, bear with me. This is a little dry, but there's a lot to get through. So, the Doppelbock. Similar to the Imperial Pilsner we saw earlier, the Doppelbock is a Bock cranked up to 11 and left there. More malt, higher alcohol, darker in color, more complex flavor. Generally, as I said, if you like Bocks, try a Doppelbock. It's going to be more and better. You know what I'm talking about, Bill. Oh, yeah. That sounds good. So, the next one is the Märzen or Oktoberfest beer. Now, before the advent of refrigeration in Germany, you couldn't actually brew during the summer months because it got too hot. The yeast would all die and it wouldn't work. So, what they made is near the tail end of March, they made specialty beers, like called Märzens, that would either have a higher alcohol content or they would cold store for the months in the middle there. Make sense? Mm-hmm. So Oktoberfest is a big celebration of you can start brewing again, so let's get rid of the leftovers. So if you ever see somebody at Oktoberfest drinking beer, they're going to be drinking a Märzen. And they are actually fantastically delicious. And, later. Lost my speaker notes. Go back. Go back. Screw it. So, anyway, now those are back. Sorry, guys. The typical Märzen is going to be similar to your box. It's going to be, back to the Märzen. Similar to your box, it's going to be a rich, full-bodied dark beer, or darker beer, but not as dark as your Bock or your Doppelbock, but much darker than your Pilsner or your Adjunct lager. And again, it's a very malty, very complex, very tasty beer. Really, I can say all these things. Try one. Any of these. If what I'm saying seems interesting or even just looks good, try one and it'll tell you infinitely more about the style of beer than I can. But I'm just trying to give you a general overview of what goes into each one. So, next one. The next one is actually something special. It's called a Rauchbier. And what they do is, in the normal malting process, after you germinate the seeds, you dry it with just normal hot air. With a Rauchbier, they actually smoke the seeds after they germinate, which imparts a very distinct smoky flavor on them, which means most of your Rauchbiers actually almost taste like spiced meat. And by comparison, they go really well with sausage because they taste like sausage. And they're by far and away one of the funkiest German beers you can find. Okay, and that's, again, Flying Dog Rauchbier. You can get that at Beers of the World, no problem. I think it's under $10 a six-pack. So, the last one to talk about is the Japanese rice lager. This is almost identical to the American Adjunct lager we discussed earlier, so your Budweiser, your Miller, your Coors, stuff like that, except it's made in Japan with a much higher rice content. That's almost exclusively what they use. It's about almost 45 to 50% rice as your base wheat. But yeah, again, you're going to get something pale, crisp, a little bubbly, refreshing. So, since this has gotten slightly boring, let's have an intermission of some German people trying to drink. Against a couple of Vermont comedy people.
I remember my first beer. Prost!
Beer Fest? Fantastic movie. You haven't seen it, check it out. Actually, first of all, what were they drinking? Anybody? Anybody got any guesses what they were drinking? Remember, they're German, they were in Germany. It was a dark beer. Bock?
Yeah.
There you go.
Yes.
You see somebody drinking a dark beer in Germany, always guess Bock. That's by far and away your safest bet. Okay? So now, we've finished discussing lagers, and we're going to move on to my personal favorite, ales. I think lagers are a little weak in the taste department. Ales, on the other hand, they're fantastic. I love them. So, our very first ale is going to be similar to a lot of your Pilsners and your basic lagers. It's a pale or golden ale. You'll see it labeled golden in a few places. A majority of them are pales. And these were originally invented by the British, but are now popular worldwide. And they vary a lot depending on where in the world you have them, because they use a lot of local hops, local malt, local ingredients. But all of them are going to be well-balanced, even amounts of malt, even amounts of hops, not one overpowering the other, clear to golden in color, and medium taste. What I have shown here is Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. It's a fantastic entry beer if you're trying to get into craft beer. If, say, you only drink Budweiser or only drink Coors. I suggest trying this. It's similar but more interesting. Make sense? Actually, who here can drink and drinks Budweiser or Miller or Coors? This is a non-judgment zone.
I think the only comparison I can make is that this is like going from a cheap plastic bottle of vodka to a decent, this was actually, brewed with some degree of care.
Yes, but it's not like going from cheap bathtub vodka to Grey Goose,
Well,
but maybe to Sobieski or Stoli.
Yeah.
Something like that.
A step up.
Exactly. This is going to be a step up from your usual adjunct lagers and a fantastic, I don't really want to say gateway drink, but a fantastic entry to the world of fancy beer. Also, if you are considering entering into the world of fancy beer, can I give you one warning? It's expensive as all get out. It has, half my co-op went to tasty beer. Great nothing. So, This one is actually my personal favorite style of beer. It is the India Pale Ale. And there's an interesting story about how this came about. It started as a traditional British Pale Ale that they were trying to ship to their troops in India. Now, if you know anything about shipping from Britain to India, you have to cross the equator, go around. It's a long trip. And they found that most of the pale ales they sent got skunked or ruined or just didn't preserve well. So what they did is they cranked up the alcohol content and added a lot more hops, because both of those act as good preservatives, as we saw with the Märzens. You add alcohol, you add hops, they will stay good over the summer. So they did the same thing with the pale ale. And that got to India, and the soldiers loved it so much that when they came back to Britain, they demanded that it continue to be brewed because they wanted to find some. They couldn't get any at home because all the India Pale Ale went to India. So that's where the India Pale Ale came from, and that's how it exists today. And because of that, an India Pale Ale compared to your average Pale Ale is going to be slightly darker in color, significantly hoppier, and higher in alcohol. So if you like hops, you like slightly more alcohol in your beer, this will work great because it will jack that up a little bit and will be more impressive. And again, if you like IPAs, there are Imperial or Dubbel IPAs, which are pretty much, most of them are marketed in such a way that you pantsy-ass little bitch, you can't handle the hops in this beer. That's how they're marketed, that's how they taste, and I love them, and there are certain IPAs I want to make a bathtub out of and curl up into a little ball and drink my way out. They're great. But yeah, if you say you have Sierra Nevada Pale Ale and you like the bitter tang to it, that's going to be the extra hops. Try stepping up to an IPA. And if you don't think that has enough hops, try stepping up to an Imperial IPA. If you don't think those have enough hops, come talk to me. I've found some that you will think have enough hops. I have found some that I think have enough hops, and I'm genetically messed up to the point where I don't taste them anymore. No, actually, and on a side note with those, if you do start drinking the heavier Imperial IPAs, they will destroy your palate. A lot of them are named like ruination or palate record because the high acid hops actually numbs your entire palate. So if you're eating spicy food, it goes great. You just don't taste spicy anymore, it just goes down. Magnificent. So our next beer is the Stout. Now, with the IPA, it was essentially a pale ale with the hops cranked up pretty high. The Stout is a pale ale with the malt cranked up pretty high. So you get a much darker, blacker, maltier, heavier, tastier beer. And let's see, there's a lot. Yeah. So your base Stout is just going to be a pale ale with a lot of those dark roasted malts in it. So again, the lovely black one. Instead of using the pale barley that I passed out earlier, they're going to use a lot of the darker roasted barley. That gives you a much darker, much more complex, much more earthy flavor. However, this actually pairs really well with certain flavors, like chocolate or coffee, or both. Oh yeah, chocolate espresso stouts. If you can find some, try it. Right, Andy?
Yes. What is it?
Chocolate espresso stout?
Yeah, they're pretty fly.
Yeah. Yeah. It also pairs really well with oatmeal to make something called a breakfast stout, which I do not officially condone drinking for breakfast, but if you can get some Founder's Breakfast Stout and happen to be out of orange juice, it's a decent substitute. And that is actually all three. It is oatmeal, chocolate, and coffee mixed into a single stout, and it's magnificent. What we have here is Old Rasputin, which is a Russian Imperial Stout. Again, what does the word Imperial mean? The word Russian, just because they made them up in Russia, because it's really cold in Siberia and having a big, rich, dark, hearty beer. That made a lot of black barley. So, Russian Imperial Stout or Imperial Stout, same general concept. It's going to be a stout, but maltier, darker, higher in alcohol. But again, if you like the flavor of stout, you'll like the flavor of Imperials because it's just that, but more. So the next one is a porter. If you look down here, I know it's, again, the colors don't come through really well in these pictures, and it's a very important part of the beer. It is very similar in color to a stout. However, unlike a stout, they're almost exclusively made with unroasted malts. How are we doing on battery?
I'm fine.
Oh, good. How am I doing on battery? Oh, sweet. So, a porter, unlike a stout, is made with unroasted malts, but you do get very similar flavors, because it's still going to use darker malts, and you're going to get a much darker, heavier, maltier beer. It's actually reasonably difficult to tell the difference between a stout and a porter, but there is one that's in the preparation, and the flavors are a little different. Stouts usually tend to be slightly heavier, slightly maltier, slightly bigger. Porters are a step down from that, essentially. And again, they pair well with like vanilla or chocolate, or even chili pepper in a few interesting cases. Oh yeah, Stone does a smoked porter with chipotle chilies, which you don't think that should work at all. It's fantastic. I recommend trying it if you can get your hands on it. So the next one. I love this beer. This is the American Strong Dark Ale. Now the example I'm using here is Double Bastard, which is by far and away one of the best beers I've ever had and my personal favorite. But the American Strong Dark Ale is essentially the epitome of the American craft beer movement. They take a traditional British beer, traditional old school beer, just a dark ale, they use a little bit extra malt than hops, and then they just go nuts with it. They crank the alcohol up. I mean, this one's got 10.5% or something, which for a beer is insane. Their average beer is 4 to 5. They crank the alcohol up, they crank the flavors up, they throw in a bunch of malt, they throw in a bunch of hops, they throw in chocolate, cherry, anything. An American Strong Dark Ale is essentially a blanket term for, in most cases, a brewery's flagship. The stuff where they just make the biggest, boldest, craziest beer they can, and they're almost all fantastic. And as I said, Double Bastard, first time I had that, I'm not going to lie to you, I actually went weak at the knees and almost fell over. It is that good. Don't judge me, Bill. It's that good.
No, it is. I was just scratching my nose.
Yeah. But yes, actually, the American Strong Dark Ale has a bigger brother, which I know, I just described it. It doesn't sound like it can go any crazier than this. It's called the barley wine. And that's the kind of stuff that gets up into the 12–15% alcohol range and is balanced with high levels of sweetness, high levels of fruit. Did I actually put a slide in for barley wine? I did not. So, again, if you like the American Strong Dark Ale, and for some reason you don't want to feel your legs by the end of the night, try a barley wine. They will put you down. They are amazing, they are fantastic, but I will warn you, they will fuck you up. Because you do not taste the alcohol, you just taste a very sweet, very richly flavored beer. And then you get halfway through the bottle and go, this is a wine, and I just drank half of it in 5 minutes. Ooh, crap. But yes, for those of you under 21, I do not in any way condone underage drinking. So our next beer is the English Bitter. Now, where the American Strong Dark Ale was the flagship of the American craft brewing movement and their proudest achievement, the English, their flagship is their bitter. It's what they make, it's what you order. If you ever see any like old British guys, they just walk into a pub, they don't look at a beer menu or anything, they order a pint of bitter. That's what they order. That is their bread and butter beer. And if you're really feeling really fancy, the extra special bitter. Because as I mentioned, the British, for some reason, don't like the imperial connotation. They use special and extra special to denote the bigger, higher alcohol ones. Now, a bitter uses, your traditional base pale ale is going to use more hops and even paler malts, which is why it's called a bitter, because the hops will impart a much bitterer flavor, and since they use old world hops, it won't actually balance that out with sweetness. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Anybody still paying attention? I didn't think so, Emily. So yes, as you can easily see from the picture, they are going to be a gold to copper in color, with a decent amount of head and good retention and a medium body to mouthfeel. So our next one is the, let's say Weissbier? Weissbier? Weissbier. Yes, my German is terrible, as you couldn't tell. It is the Weissbier, which is a German wheat ale. So they actually add wheat to your beer. And that will give it a refreshing and tart and almost even a sour taste. Because combined with the wheat, they will bottle condition it a little bit, which modifies the flavor and makes it a much, it's a fantastic summer beer. That's the best way to describe it. Think of something you'd like to drink at the end of a hot summer day. This is the beer for that. It's going to be light, it's going to be crisp, it's going to be refreshing, but it is still going to be an ale, so it is still going to have some flavor and character to it. And a little bit of grassy notes will come in just due to the uses of wheat, but that's to be expected and pretty similar. And as you can easily tell, it's going to be a pale gold to straw color. Yeah, you're using wheat, you're going to get a bit of straw color. Our next one is the Dunkelweizen, which is a wheat beer, but they use darker malts instead of the lighter, paler malts. They use darker stuff, so you end up with something a lot, well, darker, surprisingly. And you get a lot more of the darker, heavier malt flavors out of that. So your chocolates, your caramels, your smoked oaks, stuff like that is going to come through. Yeah, it's pretty simple. Once you understand the basic beer styles, a lot of them build a little bit off of those. So wheat beer is going to be your traditional German ale with wheat, whereas a Dunkelweizen is that, but with darker, heavier malts. Okay? Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you have the Hefeweizen, which is your standard Weizen, but lighter, crisper. And they use a lot more wheat, sometimes a 50-50 blend of wheat and barley, or even more wheat in some cases. So it's going to be, yes, Ian? You have your hand up? Okay. But yes, so Hefeweizen, lighter wheat beer, lower hop, lower malt. An interesting little note, the prefix Hefe means with yeast, so these are often put into the bottle with a little bit of yeast in there. Yeah, a little bit of leftover yeast, so it kind of ferments a bit in the bottle, which improves the flavor and gives it that really rich, really golden color. And properly poured, it looks damn good. There we go. Our next one is the Irish Red Ale, which you cannot tell from this picture, but they are actually red. They don't just call them Irish Reds, but they are going to be red to dark amber in color, medium hop and malt notes, well balanced, very easy to drink, very broadly appealing, but all in all, really good. Yeah, I mean, there's really not much to say about them. They have a very distinctive color, very distinctive flavor from the malts they're using, but it's balanced with hops, similar to a pale ale, but slightly different. Again, you really need to try drinking some of these if you want to know what I'm talking about. There's only so much words can do. So, the last one is, no, not the last one, but we have the Scotch Ale, or Wee Heavy. What, Bill?
Oh,
It's
I
called-
like me a good Scotch Ale.
What?
I like me a good Scotch Ale.
Try Dirty Bastard. I was drinking it while I was actually writing this slide. Oh, fantastic. Très magnifique. But yes, these are going to be a stronger, darker, and occasionally, we're in Scotland, ale. And they are, actually, they use a much longer boil on the wort, which caramelizes it and gives it that very distinctive dark color, and also gives it a very distinctive, caramely, rich, heavy flavor. And, yeah, so you get a very malty caramel taste from the longer boil on the wort. And I've actually noticed on a few of them, you can get a slightly smoky peaty taste. So if you like peaty Scotch, try a Wee Heavy. Especially try the Sam Adams Imperial Wee Heavy. That has a very pronounced peaty note. So again, yeah, if you like peaty Scotch, try Sam Adams Imperial Wee Heavy. It balances out pretty nicely. Okay? You guys are very quiet today. So, what? Lambics? Okay. So again, you know how I mentioned the crazy cousin yeasts that we don't talk to? Lambic is the other one. Lambics are actually wild fermented. So what they do is they take your like the basic beer mix, and instead of putting yeast in it, they just put it in a big tub, throw it almost out, or throw it in a room, open all the windows and leave. So whatever yeast is actually prevalent and natural in the valley will ferment the beer. Now, the reason you often see lambics like this one is a peach lambic. Lambics are usually going to get fruit added to them because the wild yeast isn't as effective as converting the sugar. So they will throw in additional fruits like apples or pears or peaches to provide extra sugar for the yeast to convert to get it up to the right alcohol. Without that added, lambics are actually a very bitter beer. But with that added, they become a very sweet, very good, again, a very good gateway beer. If you like fruity girly drinks, they're like that. Also, they go fantastic on sherbet. Don't ask me how I know that.
How do you know that?
What?
How do you know that?
I think it was last year, the year before that, at like 2 in the morning, we had leftover beer and some sherbet in the freezer. Things happen.
Oh.
But yes, so most of the lambics you're going to see here are going to be the ones with that additional fruit added to them, so they're going to be a sweeter, fruitier beer. But without them, they are a much more bitter beer because they have a high hop content. Now, what's interesting is there's actually something called a Belgian Gueuze, I believe I'm pronouncing it. It's Gueuze, it's G-U-E-Z, G-U-E-U-Z-E. UZE. And that is actually a combination of an old Lambic and a younger Lambic, and it produces a very distinctive, slightly bitter, very richly ambery malty beer, which if you can find some around here, I recommend the Lagunitas Goose. They don't make much of it, they don't ship it out, but if you can find it, give it a try. It's pretty impressive. Okay. Similar to the Lambic, we have the Saison, or the Farmhouse Ale. Now, as the name suggests, this is generally brewed for people working in fields who need a light, refreshing beer, and it's also usually brewed during the winter months when all your field hands can't be picking anything. So you have them brewing this so they can be drinking it during the summer. And it is actually, with how they brew it, gets a little on the complex side with fruity, earthy, spicy, and mildly bitter notes. But again, you can get, a lot of them are going to be a lot more complex because you can add different flavors to them. They're a good base. But at their default, they are a very nice, refreshing summer beer. But you can add a lot of spices and seasoning to them. I've actually had a couple of Saisons with rosemary in them, which makes for a very interesting beer, which I recommend trying if you can. Any questions about Saisons? Anything? Okay. Let's stay here and keep talking. So, to finish off the beers, we have the Trappist ales. So, does anybody know what a Trappist is?
Monk.
That?
Trappist monk.
Yes. Do you know how many different Trappist breweries are officially allowed to produce Trappist beers?
Considering we have 16 in the state of New York, not that can produce beer, but different like monks and
Yeah.
they're associated.
I know, there are a lot of Trappist breweries, but do you know how many of them can actually produce beer?
Let's say under 100.
A lot under 100. 2? 8.
8.
I know. One doesn't ship like anywhere. But, my notes got cut off. There are actually 8. There are 6 in Belgium, 1 in the Netherlands, and 1 in Austria. And there is an official, there's a board made up of those original 8 that, anyway, there's a board made up of those official 8 that can officially license you to produce something under the Trappist seal, which is that, I believe. You see that symbol on it? It's an official Trappist product, and there are only 8 monastery breweries in the world that can produce that. There are hundreds of thousands of Trappist monasteries, and only 8 of them can produce beers, and the beers they produce are some of the best in the world. Literally, one of them, the Westmalle 12, is. It's been consistently rated the best beer currently available in the world, and if you get it, you have to go to Belgium, to their monastery, and buy it. Except for a couple thousand very lucky people who managed to get it a couple months ago because the monastery needed a roof put in. So they shipped out a couple of, essentially shipping containers worth of stuff to the US, sold it at like $80 a 6-pack, and got a new roof. But, yes, for the official Trappist seal, back to the boring, important stuff, there are criteria that must be met. The beer must be brewed within the walls of a Trappist monastery. The brewing cannot be the main focus of the monastery. You can't just become a brewery and say, oh, we're still Trappist. No, you must maintain as a monastery. Brewing can essentially only be used as a side business to make no profit. So anything you make, cover your expenses, cover whatever you need, but anything that would be considered profit has to be donated. So it is impossible to make a Trappist beer for profit. And the last thing is, it is actually monitored by the Trappist Oversight Committee to ensure the quality, which is why Trappist beers are always fantastic and always will be fantastic. Because to be one, they have to check and they have to make sure that it is still fantastic. Okay? And there are 4 basic types of your Trappist or Belgian ale. The first one is your Belgian Pale or Belgian Strong Pale. Now, like your traditional English Pale or your Pale Lager, yeah, I know it says when you don't, isn't that funny? Anyway, so that is going to be it's actually going to be a sweeter beer due to the use of Belgian brewing sugar, which is something they add to a lot of their stuff, which gives them a very distinct, sweet, complex, fruity nose and taste. Yes?
Just a random question when you're done with this.
Give me a second. So, Belgian pales, actually all Belgians, because of that sugar, are going to be complex and tasty. And I would not advise going from Budweiser to one of those. Because it's sort of like going from a Big Mac to foie gras lobster tails. It's going to be amazing, but you won't want to have anything in the middle anymore. So try working your way up to them, because they are very, very good beers. Andy.
So as Americans in the New York area, do we have access to any of the 8 Trappist beers, or not really?
Yeah. Chimay's Trappist, Orville's Trappist, Westphalen is Trappist. I think we can get 5 or 6 of them. Beers of the World actually has a section for Trappists. It's over on their Belgian section. But we can get most of them. I think there are only 2 that we can't get out here, which is the Westphalen and Akel, I think. But yeah, no, a lot of them. You can get a lot of them. If you want me to show you where Beers of the World, I can at some point. But there's a big sign. If you go down to the American craft brew section, you turn right immediately to where the Belgians are. There's a big sign saying Trappists, and they're all right there. But you can get almost all of them here. Hell, I think Wegmans sells Chimay. So some are more widely available, but they are all magnificent. So after the Belgian Pale and Belgian Strong Pale Ale, which as you can tell is just Belgian Pale Ale, but higher and better, there's the Dubbel, which is a darker variant on the Belgian Pale. But again, they're all going to have a very similar flavor due to that Belgian sugar that they use, and occasionally the Belgian brewing yeast they will also use. And that is going to have milder hop notes, but a stronger, richer malt characteristic. Okay? And again, that's going to be darker. And if you're looking for something, Chimay Red, fantastic example of the style. It's delicious. Also pairs amazingly with steak. Just because of the rich, complex flavors goes great with a rich, complex steak. So, after the Dubbel, we unsurprisingly have the Tripel, which is like the normal pale ale, but bigger, better, tastier, crazier. Oh, okay, I gotta speed this up. Make sense? Tripel is the Belgian Pale, Belgian Strong Pale, but cranked up. And it actually uses 3 times the normal amount of malt, which is why we call it a triple. Dubbel uses twice as much, yada yada. And those are going to be very high in alcohol, but they're going to be balanced by the complex flavors, the sweetness, the maltiness, and the hops. And the very last one is the Quadrupel, which is, how do I put this? Insane. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Just,
If I was deaf, I would describe them like this.
yeah, especially 3 Philosophers, that's brewed down in Cooperstown, 3 hours away. You can get it everywhere here.
I just found that out. Anyway.
Yeah, it's so good.
Oh, it's so good. But yeah, these are big, dark, complex, fruity, very tasty, and impossible for me to describe in words. Find some, try some, and love it. Okay? And now, since we're running low on time, we're going to skip the second intermission and move straight into how to actually, now we've talked about such beers, we're going to discuss how to actually enjoy a beer. So the very first thing you need to know is how to pour. And this guy can tell you a lot better than I could.
If you aren't staying aware when you're pouring a beer, you're doing it all wrong. You may be missing out on valuable aromatics, you may be stripping the beer of carbon dioxide, or you may not be putting an appropriate amount of head on the top of your beer. That's bad.
Yeah, that makes me sad.
In the end, your beer tasting experience will suffer. Now I'm going to show you the right way to pour a beer. Step 1 is to make sure you have a beer clean glass. That means that it's free of any residue, any cleaning detergents, chemicals, anything that could impact the flavor of the beer or the appearance of the beer. I'm angling the glass at about 45 degrees, and I'm going to start by pouring just an inch or so above the lip of the glass, and I'm going to try to land right in the center of the side of the glass. And then I see that there's not a whole lot of head being produced, so I'm going to tilt, and I'm going to try to pour down in the center and try to produce just about a half an inch to an inch of head.
2 fingers is usually a good way to do it.
Certain beers, like English-style beers and Lambic beers, often have very minimal head. You can be a lot more aggressive, pouring the beer down into the center of the glass and allowing it to hit the glass with a little bit of force so that some of the carbonation is released into the head. Some beers, like Pilsners and bottle-conditioned Belgian beers, are extremely effervescent, producing a lot of foam from a pour, and you might need to work very hard to try to keep the foam down to the desired inch to half an inch of head. nice, attractive-looking head that also has some of the best aroma compounds of this beer. You're going to notice it when you bring the glass up to your mouth.
Okay? Yeah, that's how you pour a beer. Usual general trick, hold the book at 45 degrees angles, and then as you near the top, tilt it back up and get some head produced. Okay, next slide. Right. Now on to the fun stuff. How to actually, if you're going to taste a beer and to savor it instead of just chug it or shotgun it. I don't condone those, by the way, because if it's a beer that you are willing to shotgun, it's not a beer you should be drinking. But anyway, the way to do it properly is pick up your glass and actually look at it. Look at the color, look at the sides of it, look at the head, look at the color of the head that you're getting. What's the consistency? Is it going to be a thick, bubbly? Heck, you've got some that have very thin bubbles, almost look like champagne, whereas others that will end up with whipped cream on the top. Look at it, see what it looks like, and enjoy. Next step is to swirl it around in your glass. This opens it up, induces a bit of oxygen, promotes carbonation, releases a lot of the flavors, so you get a much more noticeable smell out of it when you finally do smell it. And it will also produce something called legs on the beer, because when you swirl it, bits of the foamy head will stick to the side of the glass and slowly drip their way down. And in higher alcohol beers, you can actually see a separation between the foam and the liquid, which can give you a good indication of whether or not what you're drinking and put it on the ground. So it's a good way of checking. So if you spin it around and look at it and just see the drops, you can tell roughly the alcohol content. Again, it's a lot more obvious when you're actually drinking it. Yes, Andy? No. Oh, okay. Okay, so the next step is smell. If you really want to smell a beer, I know this is going to look kind of silly at a bar, but just take your nose and go, stick your face right in that sucker and smell everything. Smell the aroma, smell the flavors. There's going to be, I can't list all the things you could possibly smell in a beer, because it's as rich and varied as what you can put into a beer and what comes out of a beer and what you're going to get from the malt. This is by far and away the most important step, because as you know, most of what you taste actually comes from the smell. You only have a few basic taste receptors. So really smell it, really get that in your nose, and if you have to, give it a swirl. That'll loosen it up and release more flavors. So swirl it around, take another whiff. It'll usually change the smell of the beer. So the final step, fun step, taste it. Take the beer, pour it into your mouth, let it sit there for a little bit. Notice how it feels in your mouth. As I was mentioning, like lighter to heavier bodied beers, the way that sort of works is, you know the variants of milk, you have skim, 1%, 2% whole. Familiar how when you drink those, skim tastes a lot thinner and waterier, whereas whole milk is going to be a creamier, buttery feel? That's what I mean. A lighter body beer is going to taste closer to skim milk, whereas a heavier body beer is going to taste closer to whole milk. Make sense? It tastes like, let it feel, figure out how to describe it, and then let the flavors actually move around your mouth, working in different areas, tasting in different places. And I mean, the best way to describe how to taste something is to give you a beer and say, taste it and tell me what you taste. I'm sorry I can't do that in this talk, but really, if you want to learn more about how to taste beer, follow these steps and then just go out and drink some beer. And the final step, which I don't actually have a slide for, right? I want to have a slide for, which is when you're done tasting it, after you swallow it, savor it for a bit. Think about it. Do I like this beer? Do I not like this beer? What do I like about this beer? What do I not like about this beer? What's good about it? What's not good about it? Okay? So everybody got the 4.5 steps or so? Fantastic. For example, if you take Wines of the World, you're going to teach you pretty much the exact same steps. They use S's though. So, after you taste a beer, it's a very good chance it might end up skunked, which is what happens when either too much oxygen or too much light gets into a beer. And in that case, it destroys the flavor, it destroys any... If you get a skunked beer, dump it down the drain. And it is very obvious if a beer is skunked. If you're asking yourself, is this skunked or bad or good? It's probably not skunked. If you take one sip of it and go, holy crap, this is terrible, who fed this to me, then it's skunked. And just on a small point of contention, after what I just told you, does better beer come in cans or bottles? Let's do a general question. Bottle? Okay, who here thinks cans are better? Who here thinks bottles are better? Okay, I'm going to repeat what I said. You can skunk a beer by letting light or oxygen in. Who here thinks cans are better? Okay, who here thinks that cans that block out all light and seal completely airtight on the top when made correctly are better than bottles which block out roughly 80% of the light and let air in through the crown cap? For a beer. Yeah, bottles seem classier. It's sort of like wine corks versus plastic screw-on tops. Plastic screw-on tops are actually better for wine. Nobody wants to admit that in the fancy wine world, but they are. Whereas cans are better for good beer. Unless you have bottle-conditioned ones, which need a much heavier bottle and a much thicker cork. Yes, Pat?
This is why we have wine cellars and not wine attics with sunroofs.
Same thing applies to beer. You can age it in just the same way. We'll mention that later. But yeah. So, yes?
Wouldn't there be something between like glass versus the actual metal?
It never, the way cans are made and treated, it never comes in contact with the actual metal.
They're lined.
Yep, they're lined. So it doesn't ruin it in any way, shape, or form. So cans are objectively better. Bottles are objectively classier. So there's your problem. Yeah?
Just on a side note, as a brewer, there's reasons why you would pick a bottle over a can.
Oh yeah.
Like for example, if you wanted to have a beer, like you said, like Hefeweizen, where you wanted to have yeast inside it, the bottle is better because it more easily allows for fermentation during transportation and storage than the can.
I know. I'm just trying to remove the stigma from all these guys because a lot of people will see a canned beer and think, oh, well, that's crap. Some of the best beers I've ever had come out of cans. 21st Amendment, exclusively cans their stuff, makes fantastic beer. Oscar Blues, exclusively cans their stuff, makes fantastic beer. Heady Topper, probably the best IPA I've ever consumed in my life, and quite possibly the best made in the world, only comes in cans. So if you see a beer in a can, do not automatically dismiss it. If you see a beer with the Budweiser logo on it, go nuts and automatically dismiss the overwhelming crap out of that bad boy. But a can on its own is not a bad thing. And there's actually, if you look at it, there's a trend towards using more cans in craft brewing. So you might see more of them. Don't be afraid of cans. You can get just as good a beer, if not better, out of a can than you can out of a bottle. Okay? So, we're almost done here. Last thing I want to talk to you about is glassware. Now, for 90% of the improvement you're going to get out of pouring beer into a glass will come from just pouring a beer into a glass. If you want to go nuts, there are plenty of different shapes of glass that are better for different types of beer. But seriously, your standard mug, your standard pint glass, those will massively improve any beer you're drinking. Even a Budweiser, it's better to drink it out of a glass than it is out of the can. Because that will open it up, let you actually smell it, let it move around a little, give it a bit more flavor, open the head up. It's better. So if you can, at all, pour it into a glass, drink it out of a glass. As far as the actual glasses we have here, yep, the one on the far left is a Nonic glass, which is cheap and easy to make and store. It's great for your average session beers, your standard, like Sam Adams, stuff like that. Fantastic. The next one is a Pilsner glass, and as you can see here, it's very good for showcasing the color and the bubbliness of the beer, and very good for head retention. I know the head kind of blends in with the background, but that's all head. And it looks, again, it looks good, and it will stay there in Pilsner glass because that's how it's shaped. The next one is a tulip, and if you'll notice from the shape, it goes out and comes back in, and then goes out a little. And that actually allows the flavors, the smells in the nose of the beer to come up, become concentrated, and then open up into your mouth. So it works really well for darker, more complex beers like Belgians or IPAs or stouts. Oh, it's fantastic for stouts. So that's actually, tulips are great for your bigger, your heavier, your more complex beers because they concentrate the smell and make it better. And they'll also actually give you a slightly bigger head. And the very last one on here is a Weizen glass. Again, great for showcasing the color of the beer because Weizens are very pretty beers. And also good for capturing the distinctive aromas of that style because of the little bulge here at the top. And again, like the Pilsner glass, good for head retention, good for color and clarity. But as I said, don't worry about all of this until you become a crazy beer snob like me. For now, just pour your beer into a glass, it'll make it so much better. So, advanced topics we will not be getting into today because, trust me, that rabbit hole goes way too deep for a RandTalk, a tech talk, or a course. You can talk about things like properly aging beers and bottle fermentation and how that changes it over time and all that stuff. Or maybe the different hop variants, like the ones I gave you, not just the Old World versus New World, but different types of New World or different areas you get it from, light hops. It's crazy. There's a lot of crazy stuff in there, and I will gladly discuss any advanced topics with any of you, preferably over a pint, but if you're under 21, I will gladly discuss it at any point. So for now, I'm just going to leave you with, there's a lot of stuff we didn't cover, but I think I got a very good overview of the basic things you need to know about beer. So, any questions? Andy?
So I'm 21 and I've never had beer before, but I learned a lot today.
Yep.
What do you think would be maybe 3 beers from Beers of the World that you would recommend to me?
3 from Beers of the World. I would probably recommend the Lagunitas Pils. It's a good example of a Czech style Pilsner. Very crisp, very clear, very light. Maybe the Boston Lager or Boston Ale, again, good example of the style. And then probably for something more complicated, stout like, it's a good base stout. Southern Tier does a very good basic stout. So I would suggest the Southern Tier stout, the Lagunitas Pils, and then probably the, actually I'm going to change the Boston one to the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. Okay? Anything else?
That's an awesome owl.
Ian?
What's your opinion on picking your beer off the menu by how cool the name is?
Sure, go nuts. I've gotten a lot of really great beers just by going, dude, that name is awesome, or dude, that label is really cool. So yeah, go nuts.
Like ordering your wife based on how nice your name sounds. That's that idea.
I don't know. Your wife? Iniquity turned out really well for me. So.
Because Inequity's really good.
Yeah.
Who? Yes. It's an inquisitive owl. You have any questions, Bill? No. Oh, okay.
No, Bill, your question should have been if you want to go get a
Someone
beer.
who's
Oh,
sampled
man,
like
do you
a
want to go
couple
get a beer?
beers.
Oh, we're done here, yeah.
Yeah.
Someone who sampled a couple beers over various years, compliments
Yep.
of parents,
Yep.
and found she hasn't liked them probably because hops.
Yep.
What is a good beer to start introducing? Because I find I like the fruity stuff better, but I want to see if it's just something with me or something that's prepared, and whether or not I actually do or do not like beer. What I start with?
Okay. So what flavors do you like, just in general?
Fruitier things.
Try
Like-
Lambic.
Like I like the champagnes and whatnot, and the sparkling waters.
Try like a peach or a raspberry Lambic is probably a good one to start with. Those are definitely going to be fruitier because, again, they have additional fruit added to them.
Something else you might want to try is like some of the fruity beers, the Hefeweizen.
Yeah. I was going to say those.
Like Blue Moon is a really good one. And what's that one? Harpoon. I think Harpoon has one. A raspberry Hefeweizen.
Purple Haze? Is that the one you think
That's
of?
not it, but that's
That's
another
not,
one.
no, that's a Beta. Yeah, I got it.
Avita, Purple Haze, and Blue Moon. Probably a good choice.
Yep.
Also ciders.
Ciders are good. They're not strictly beers, but they are, yeah.
It's a good gateway.
It is a very good gateway. Hard cider, good gateway too. Again, I do not in any way promote underage drinking. Hard cider is a fantastic gateway beer.
But Todd, as a responsible member of the SSC, you never condone that.
He's condoning gateway beers for newly 21-year-olds.
Yes, newly 21-year-olds. I am
Who've never
condoning
drank alcohol,
ciders,
gotta be like
lambics, like fruity Hefeweizens, good gateway beers if you don't really like beers and you like fruitier things. Like juice. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you for coming to my talk. It's been a pleasure talking to you.